The heavy scent of wet earth clung to the air as floodlights cut through the midnight fog. Down below, 35 brand-new luxury homes gleamed under the moonlight, roofs so new they still smelled of tar, driveways lined with imported pavers, and all of them stood on land that legally belonged to me. For 2 years, the HOA had ignored my deeds, erased my boundaries, and built their empire brick by brick on stolen soil. Tonight, the gate valves on my private dam were about to open. By morning, Pine Valley Estates would learn what happens when you steal from a man who controls the water you drink. 2 years earlier, I'd been just another quiet landowner in Cedar Hollow, a Colorado mountain town where winters bit hard and summer shimmered with green. My 120 acres bordered Pine Valley Creek, the only fresh water source for the new subdivision, rising on the other side of the valley. The land had been in my family since 1894, deeded to my grandfather after he built the original dam for the logging camps. Over the years, it became our lifeline, irrigating fields, feeding cattle, and, in modern times, supplying water rights to half the county. When Pine Valley Estates broke ground, I thought nothing of it, until survey stakes appeared well inside my fence line. Weeks later, bulldozers rolled in, flattening pasture grass older than the men driving them. I called the developer, an HOA board president named Gerald Pike, all slick suits and silk ties, and reminded him of my property line. His response was a polite smile and a legal notice claiming eminent domain. Only one problem. This wasn't government seizure. This was private theft, wrapped in HOA stationery. They pushed ahead anyway, pouring slabs, selling homes, even landscaping yards on ground my title deed described in black ink. My formal complaints vanished into county bureaucracy. By the time lawyers finally confirmed the truth, that my rights were airtight, 35 homes already stood on stolen earth. That's when I stopped asking for justice and started planning revenge. I'm not the type to shout. I've spent my life reading the land, not courtrooms. But I learned a few things from my father, a man who fought water wars against ranchers, developers, and once even the state. Rule 1. In the West, water is power. Rule 2. Never swing first in a fight you can win with patience. The HOA thought my quiet was weakness. They sent their lawyers, their inspectors, even private security guards to remind me the community had needs. One guard laughed when he said they owned the valley now. What they didn't understand was that the creek running through their pristine subdivision wasn't fed by nature alone. It was fed by my dam, a century-old granite wall 40 feet high, holding back millions of gallons of spring melt. I kept it in perfect condition. My father taught me how to grease the gate gears, how to read the pressure dials, how to open it slow enough to feed the valley or fast enough to scour it clean. The HOA used my water without paying a cent. They never asked, never signed a contract. And with the stolen land, they'd built their million-dollar homes directly in the downstream floodplain. They had no idea that one steel wheel in my pump house controlled everything they had built. And when Gerald Pike threatened to take the rest of my acreage for community expansion, I decided the rest of my patience was over. The legal battle became a slow, grinding war. They filed for adverse possession, claiming my family had abandoned the land. I countered with century-old tax receipts and state-certified water rights documents. I hired a surveyor who placed neon orange markers in every backyard they'd stolen. The sight drove residents into HOA meetings in a panic. Gerald told them I was bluffing, that no court would rule against community progress. But I wasn't aiming for court anymore. The county's refusal to intervene was the final push. I realized the only people who could enforce my rights were me. So I waited, watched the valley through binoculars from my porch, memorized their routines, the HOA's irrigation schedule, the sprinklers misting lawns in the pale light of dawn, the way the creek swelled after a heavy rain, pressing against the dam like a held breath. Then came the perfect storm. Weeks of late summer rain, filling the reservoir to the brim, followed by an unseasonably warm week melting snow from the high peaks. The lake behind my dam swelled until the spillway roared. That's when I tested the gates. One half-turn, and a jet of icy water shot down the channel, carving a groove in the bank. I closed it again, satisfied the mechanics still worked. 2 days later, the HOA mailed me a final warning. They intended to fence off the dam for community safety on my land. It was signed by every board member. I read it once, folded it neatly, and set it beside my father's old wrench. The next morning, under cover of heavy fog, I walked the quarter-mile to the pump house. The steel door groaned open. Inside, the smell of oil and river moss was thick. My hands rested on the wheel, cold, damp, heavy with rust. I thought of my grandfather building the dam stone by stone, my father teaching me to respect the water's power, and I began to turn. At first, the release was subtle. The gates groaned, water hissing through the narrow gap. Downstream, the creek widened, quickened, the banks beginning to crumble. By the time I'd opened the valves halfway, the roar was deafening. A wall of white water surged forward, sweeping branches, silt, and decades of debris toward Pine Valley Estates. From my vantage point on the ridge, the first impact was almost beautiful, water curling over manicured lawns, filling decorative ponds until they spilled into the streets. Driveways became rivers. Expensive landscaping peeled away like carpet under the current. Residents scrambled, shouting over the noise. Some tried to move cars. Others waded waist-deep to rescue patio furniture. Gerald Pike stood in the cul-de-sac, phone to his ear, screaming for emergency crews. They never realized the storm had no end, because I hadn't closed the gates. Hours passed. The creek became a torrent. Foundations groaned. One house listed sideways, its stilts sinking into liquefied soil. By nightfall, the subdivision was unrecognizable. Streets were canals. Basements filled to the ceiling. Power transformers hissed and exploded under the rising water. I closed the gates at midnight, leaving behind a drowned neighborhood, still standing, but ruined from the inside. Mold would bloom in days. Structural damage would take months to assess. Insurance adjusters would find the truth in years. And every one of those findings would trace back to a simple fact. They'd built on land they didn't own, below a dam they didn't control. The HOA's fury was immediate. They called it sabotage, terrorism, even attempted murder. But in court, my lawyers laid out the facts. The dam was private property. The gates had been lawfully operated within my water rights. The subdivision had no legal easement, no contract, and no claim to the creek beyond what nature provided. The flood was a natural consequence of record rainfall and meltwater. The home's destruction was the direct result of the HOA's decision to build on an active floodplain without permits. And then came the twist. My surveyor's report entered into evidence, showing every destroyed home sat squarely inside my deeded land. In one afternoon, the court invalidated every property title the HOA had sold. The homeowners were furious, at the board, not me. Class action lawsuits bloomed overnight. Gerald Pike resigned and vanished from town. State regulators investigated misuse of funds. Over $2 million missing from HOA accounts. The story went national. The man who drowned subdivision became a headline in papers from Denver to London. Environmental lawyers praised it as a landmark case in water rights. For me, it was simpler. It was the end of a war they started, and proof that in the West, the man who controls the water controls everything. It took a year for the valley to heal. The HOA dissolved under bankruptcy. The ruined homes were sold for pennies, stripped to studs, or demolished outright. The land reverted to me, exactly as the deeds had promised. I didn't rebuild. I planted. Rows of willows now drink from the same creek they once tried to steal. Deer graze where kitchens once stood. The dam remains stronger than ever, gates freshly oiled, stone face sealed for another century. When asked if I do it again, I tell the truth. I never wanted destruction, but I wanted justice more. And sometimes, justice flows like water, slow to build, unstoppable when released. Today, Pine Valley Creek runs clear. And every spring, when the melt swells the reservoir, I walk to the pump house, rest my hand on the steel wheel, and remember the night I took back what was mine. To anyone facing an HOA that thinks it owns you, remember this. They can take your peace. They can take your land. But if you hold the source, they hold nothing.